We're now going to have a panel which we will try to kind of open things up to visions of the human future in space and what it is all about. And I think what we'll do is we'll just take a, have each member of the panel make some remarks and in terms of where they think that this could go. And then we'll open it up to questions and interaction. Okay. Because well, first let me introduce the panel. You've already met Story Musgrave, astronaut. You know me. You know J. Richard Gott, the cosmologist who spoke to us last night. And over here is Dr. Bruce Cordell, who hails, like me, originally from the aerospace industry. He worked for General Dynamics. He was doing Mars mission design for them in competition with us at Martin. And
we lost, too. But.
Yeah, well, no, but he had a lot of great ideas. He did that for a while and put out his own shingle and is a consultant and a futurist, I'd say, fair to say. So beyond that, I guess I'll kick it off a little bit. I see Mars not as a utopia, but as a lab. That is, in terms of human expansion to Mars. I think what you have with, and I guess I'll just sit down, the human opening of a new planet is you're opening up a new frontier, and that is a place where the rules haven't been written yet. And that's a wonderful thing. And where, although it's a dangerous thing, but it's also a wonderful thing, it's a place where people have a chance to go. And once the place is, once we've developed the technologies that allow human beings to be self-sufficient on Mars, it will be a place where new branches of human civilization can develop. And I think that the well of human social thought is not exhausted by the current age. That while our society has, in particular American society, in my view, very high on America compared to certain alternatives on this planet. But nevertheless, there is injustice here. There is limitation of human potential. And I think there will always be people with new ideas on how people might try to live together and make a civilization and want to give their ideas a try. And typically, such people are not popular with those around them. But the founders of this country called it a noble experiment. And they had a chance to come to a place where the rules of the prior society, institutions of the prior society, blood aristocracy, religious hierarchies, guilds, many other things that were very solidly in place in Europe in particular, had much more tenuous hold here. And they were able to take some ideas that there were certainly people in Europe who thought about them too, what you might call Enlightenment ideas, freedom of the press, let people vote for their government, trial by jury, right to bear arms, freedom of religion, and we're going to give this a try. And while in the salons of Europe, many of these ideas were heard, that people who advocated them sincerely were, generally regarded as pleasantly insane. Because, after all, if you let everyone believe whatever they want, it's a formula for social chaos. If you let people elect a government, democracy actually has quite a checkered history. Athens fell because demagogues got control of its democracy. How do you actually make that work? Trial by jury, how are you ever going to convict a criminal? They come from the rabble. right to bear arms, what can one say? And yet, despite all sorts of reasons for skepticism, because this place was far enough away from Europe that those institutions could not maintain their hold here, these new ideas were given a try, and they worked, and then people voted with their feet to come here, and it really set the pattern for what the standard for what modern civilization is. Now, there were other experiments tried in the New World, in Paraguay, in Haiti, in other places, according to certain other utopian ideas, and they were disasters, okay? I mean, they were total disasters, okay, because not all new ideas are good ideas. But nevertheless, to have that degree of freedom, and, people go to Mars. When humans settle on Mars, they will give all kinds of ideas a run, and many novel ideas will cause those colonies to fail. But those that hit upon something better will thrive and will become examples for the Earth and for humans everywhere. And so thus having this broader sphere of action, and then of course as people move out into the asteroids and ultimately interstellar and still greater degrees of freedom in this respect, that is mobility essentially, greater and greater diversity of human cultures, and you have this opportunity. A major feature of the 20th century, the late 20th century, is, people say it's a small world. It is now possible to fly to Europe in 4 or 5 hours on a jet. Communication is instant around the world. And so cultures are fusing. And there's good aspects to that. And cultural fusions can be quite productive. And on the other hand, there is a certain pathos to seeing McDonald's in Paris. No, I mean, really, because if you have certain unique aspects of human culture being ironed out, it's kind of like, well, first of all, that diversity is very useful. In any species or family of animals, for example, diversity is useful because the more different types of them there are, the greater the chance of survival if things change, that one or another of them will have the right traits to survive and proceed. But I think that's also true of human culture and human ideas. And so the creation of a single global culture, so if we remain on one planet, is probable. And the loss of the diversity of human cultures is over time is, in my view, probable. And there are there are positive aspects of this, but there's also something being lost. But yet the same general level of technology that has made the Earth one world, well, certainly the communications technologies, and while we're not going to take jet planes to Mars, the sort of general level of technology represented by competent commercial jet air traffic is also the generalized level of technology that makes interplanetary flight possible. So the same level of technology that makes the Earth a small world makes it possible for us to access other worlds, which are accessible with this technology, but yet remote, and in which diversity is possible. And then when humans settle Mars, okay, we're going to go to Mars the first time in ships that are projected on ballistic orbits. It takes 6 months to get to Mars, and they're going to be small and cramped and very Spartan. But once people are established on Mars, there's going to be an incentive to develop technologies that make interplanetary travel much more routine. Just as Columbus sailed the Atlantic with 3 ships that even 50 years later no one would have attempted the Atlantic in. Okay, because in Columbus's day no one had ships that were designed for the Atlantic. But once you establish European civilization as transatlantic, then you started to develop three-masted caravels and later clipper ships, and then steamboats and ocean liners and Boeing 747s, so that, you know, today we travel across the Atlantic on comfortable airliners, and, you know, it's almost unbelievable to hear the stories of your grandparents who did it in the holds of tramp steamers. And yet, at that time, it was incredible to hear, you know, of 2 generations before that, where people did it on small pitching sailing ships. And so, you know, 50 or 100 years after the first human settlements are on Mars, people are not going to go to Mars in 6 months on cramped little tuna can spacecraft. They will sail the interplanetary ocean in fusion-powered spacecraft that are large, commodious, and, you know, do it in 3 weeks. And the grandchildren of the first Martian settlers won't believe the stories of what it was like the first time. But yet, those technologies that make Mars routine will open up much vaster outer reaches of the solar system, where once again, but, you know, in other words, where they have a marginal capability to reach. And when those are settled, they will drive the creation of still more advanced technologies that will open the way to the stars. And so I see this as a wonderful but messy process, because there's going to, you know, you're letting things loose. You're going to let things out of control. But while bad things will happen, good things will happen. And to me, this is my vision of the human future in space. Expansive, diverse, messy. You know, people say, how do you know you won't mess up on Mars? Well, you don't. How do you know your baby won't be the next Hitler? You don't. Okay, but that doesn't stop us from having children, okay? Because you're creating something new. You know, and we just have to proceed on the basis of optimism that overall we'll get it right. Overall, on the whole. So that's my vision, and why don't one of you like to speak? Professor Gott, what do you think?
Well, let me say a few things that Story's wonderful talk brought to mind. I mean, my talk at the banquet last night was that I think the goal of human spaceflight program is to increase our survival prospects by colonizing space. And I think that that vision of people that wanted to explore and see what was beyond the next hill and spread out and make copies, this is good for survival. I think it's one of the reasons we have that wanderlust in our genes. The other thing is that I think we should colonize it as soon as possible. And Story mentioned the importance of the goal that Kennedy set with a short time limit to go for the moon. This clarified many of the engineering issues. For example, every kid's book about going to the moon at that time started out with the building of a big 200-foot diameter rotating space station, and then you built the lunar craft there, and then you went on. That was the first step, obviously, that you would do. But the goal was very clarifying, because they said, well, let's skip the space station, because we don't have time to do that. We should go direct to the moon. And of course, this is something that Dr. Zubrin has indicated in the Mars Direct. If we want to go to Mars, we should get there directly. The Augustine Commission that advised President Obama on his policy started out with a discussion that ended up with the conclusion that the purpose of the human spaceflight program was to expand human civilization into the solar system. That's what it was for. And then they concluded that if we were ever going to live anywhere else in the solar system, well, Mars would be the first place, because it's the most habitable place that we can find in the solar system. And so they said, then Mars is the ultimate goal. And then they said, but, it's like when someone says, I love you, but. Then they said, but it's not the best proximate goal. And then they described doing all sorts of other things, like visiting an asteroid, or visiting the Lagrange point, or visiting even Mars's moons. And until Mars becomes the proximate goal, we will not get there. I think it's important also the individuals, as he indicated. Von Braun had plans to go to Mars by 1982, and Nixon stopped it. And these small events like this can be very influential. I personally think it's one of the things that's a shame was that after the United States landed on the moon, the Russian response to this was to build a space station. The Russian response to this could have been to do a flyby of Mars. After all, they had an Energia spacecraft, which is a heavy lift vehicle. They could have flown by Mars, as Arthur C. Clarke indicated, fly by Mars, fly by Venus, return to Earth. And then they could have bragged that, like, this is how far the Americans have gone, and we have gone, this distance. And if that had happened, undoubtedly the United States would have landed on Mars by now, and we'd be living in a different world. Today, I think the Chinese have an opportunity to dock in orbit with a spacecraft and with enough fuel and do a simple figure-8 flight around the moon like Apollo 13 did. And they could go after the human altitude record and with the right configuration and say, we've been further than anyone else, and look, we're going to the moon. That might be something that would catch the world's attention, a sort of Sputnik kind of thing, and might get the Americans more interested in doing things. We're seeing today a robot landing on Mars, and I think this will be as nerve-wracking, as exciting as even watching a manned landing. The thing is that as robots get more and more sophisticated and more expensive, we care about them. This is a $2.5 billion robot, and all our hopes for doing all these interesting things on Mars rest on this robot. It's like the Hubble Space Telescope. We cared about what happened to the Hubble Space Telescope. We cared that Story was able to fit it with eyeglasses that could improve its vision. The ultimate robot that people would want would be one that's autonomous and artificial intelligence. The goal of that eventually is to have a self-conscious robot that could explore Mars. And even better than that would be the von Neumann machine, which could reproduce itself. And then you just put a couple of robots on Mars, and they would reproduce themselves and fill up the whole planet. And of course, well, actually, that's sort of what we're like. So if you want to answer all your questions ultimately about Mars, was there life there? Is there any fossil life anywhere on the planet? Why sending people there is one way to find out. And you have to send people that are willing to go to Mars and live there to found a colony, who would rather be the founders of a Martian civilization than come home to a ticker tape parade in New York. And I remember I once asked Story if he would sign up for a one-way trip to Mars, and he said absolutely he would. So I think he's a perfect demonstration that you could find exceptional people to go and colonize Mars, and I hope that we can do that sooner rather than later.
Okay, Bruce?
Thank you. Well, I too was really thrilled by Story's presentation, and I wish I could watch it again, and hopefully I'll get a chance to see it again sometime. And I want to pick up on the historical thread of it, but before I do, because that's very important in envisioning what the future related to Mars may be, thinking about how history worked. But before I get there, let me just say a word about Phobos Grunt, the Russian-China mission to Mars that was going to be a sample return mission to Phobos. Incredible thing. And unfortunately it failed, but I thought it had tremendous potential for a variety of reasons. One reason is because goes way back to the 80s, at a Case for Mars conference, which was in Boulder, there was a small committee, boy, this was a really small committee, talking about what you could do with Phobos before you actually get to Mars. And we liked the idea of treating it like a space station because it has milligravity and it could be wet, so you could make it into a filling station. And we thought the first step should be a sample return. So it sounded to us like they were taking our recommendations, which was pretty cool. And unfortunately, the thing failed. What I thought might happen in my wildest fantasies, which I wrote about openly before the mission, was if it was successful, I had the feeling that maybe in the back of their minds they might take that as a signal they should jointly use Phobos to start their own manned colonization of Mars together, using the moons of Mars. Unfortunately, all of this is history, doesn't matter now, but I mean, it could have worked out that way. I think they might have been able to pull that off for a variety of reasons. Now they both say they're going to the moon, and which is, I don't know, that's not as exciting. It's probably, from their point of view, more realistic. Let me talk a little bit about something that I think is really important, and that is what you can learn from history, and I won't be too long about this, in terms of what's possible in the future related to big space missions like sending humans to Mars. I've been working with a number of collaborators. I've been lucky to be able to find these people, and one was absolutely the best NASA cost analyst I've ever met. And being in the cost discipline may not sound real exciting, but boy, it really is important, and it's a very difficult discipline. And I just ran into Joe Hamaker, who used to work for SAIC in Huntsville. And I told him what we really need to do is go back and look at the costs of all the space missions in the history of NASA to see what the message of that was. It sounds like it would give you a headache, and it did many times. It took us a long time to actually process this information. When you actually plot this data, you find out that it's in a power law, the size frequency distribution for all the unmanned and manned programs that NASA's ever done is surprisingly in what's called a power law distribution. I won't get too technical here. It's even fractal, which is even a worse word to use in public. And what that means is that, first of all, NASA space missions are what are called self-similar. It means fundamentally, make a long story short, the small, the inexpensive NASA space missions were generated somehow through the big system, however it works, in the same way that the medium-sized missions and the large missions are generated. Now, to me, that was a shocker, because I initially was interested in trying to figure out how you could go to Mars and what it took to generate a program like that for the future, and I expected there to be different rules of the game. It turns out that's not true. That's a very powerful result that puts real constraints on how you can imagine the future actually happening. Now, that all by itself has implications for what's called a critical state, which is what we sort of call the 60s, a time when it felt like everything was perfect in terms of NASA. NASA had a perfect organization for the mission they were asked to do. Not everything went perfectly, but it was a time when some extraordinary things were possible. That's not really true yet today. We're kind of coming around into another critical state. Now, to be able to make that statement, there was one more piece of the puzzle that was necessary, and that is we had to sort of look further back than the 60s to see what would happen with space missions. The trouble is, of course, there weren't any. So the best you can do is look at great human explorations that are analogous to space missions. In other words, going all the way back to Lewis and Clark and seeing what you can actually see about those missions. And there are many things, I won't get into it. But the first thing I noticed that struck me was there are only a few of them that were truly transformative, that turned on international audiences at the time. I think everybody has heard the story of Dr. Livingstone in Central Africa, who disappeared for a brief time, who was so well known in this country that Henry Stanley was sent from a New York newspaper to go find him. That's how concerned people were. That's how into this particular great exploration, which was a mid-19th century thing, people got. And that's typical of the excitement. It's like the excitement of Apollo. And there are many parallels there I could go into that are very interesting. The other thing that's interesting is that these big explorations, including the early 20th century one, which involved the polar regions, it was called Pole Mania, by the way, because people were crazy about it. Just like the Panama Canal was called Panama Fever or Canal Fever, because people were crazy about that. It's big technology. And so the idea is that one thing you always see during a large, great exploration, whether it's space or not, and I didn't expect this, and that is rapid economic growth seems to be a prerequisite. They had JFK-like booms at both of those times, mid-19th century, believe it or not, and the early 20th century, which is less difficult to believe because it was when Theodore Roosevelt was around, who was an all-around fun guy, from what I can tell, reading history about him. So this is a hint. This is telling you, well, I've suggested more than once that the reason we haven't gone to Mars before now is because we haven't had a JFK-like economic boom since the 60s. And that may be a controversial idea, I don't know, but I think it's actually true. And if that's correct, what it means is that we're not likely to go there until such a thing actually occurs. Now, getting back to my little point about what the fractal nature of the cost data implies, when I looked at these four great explorations over the last 200 years, what struck me is it reminded me of something called punctuated equilibrium, which is something that people who are interested in biological evolution have talked about publicly in the past. It's something that relates to financial systems. This is a very broad concept. It works for earthquakes and so forth. And what's interesting about it is that it suggests that the actual international system which creates these advanced missions is a spontaneous self-organizing process. This is really powerful stuff, and it's not a new idea, but it is related to space. And it suggests that this has been going on since the 60s, this self-organizing process, and we're literally headed toward a new critical state, much like the 60s. The timing on this is by mid-decade, believe it or not. And there are all sorts of interesting nuances about this. There are short-term precursors for this critical state which are observed, and I won't tell you what they are because I don't want to take too much time. But I would say that we're looking at the potential for a large space program in the ballpark by 2015, which I think is particularly good news given the state of things right now. And this is politically independent, by the way. You might not think so. But this whole system, which has apparently worked all the way back to Lewis and Clark, the critical states I'm talking about, that appear at these times of rapid economic growth, have both good things and bad things associated with them. They have spectacular exploration that we just talked about. The Peace Corps, of course, was created in the 60s. It may be a bumpy road, though, at times, because you remember about this time in the early 60s, there was this thing called the Cuban Missile Crisis. That was a bad news thing. That's part of the critical state. And exactly what will happen is unclear, but it looks to me like that'll be our best chance in most of our lifetimes to actually send people to Mars, and that in between roughly 2015 and 2025. People that try to sell you human Mars missions much after 2025 ignore the history of the last 200 years. These critical states, which we also call Maslow windows for another reason, collapse. And they usually collapse in response to geopolitical conflicts. And but I think on the whole, it's a very positive potential future. There's another question, and I may get into this again if I'm allowed to speak, if I haven't run out of time. But that is what makes me think that there'll be a manned Mars mission as opposed to something else. And that's less certain. But I think